Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on Guidelines for Conducting Effective Workplace Investigations, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're so happy you can join us. My name is Deb Beto, and I will be your moderator today and be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. All of the webinar materials we discuss can be found at http://heffernan-webinars.htm. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down right now. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. If you have audio difficulties or a telephone line goes dead during the call, hang up and call back again to the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear, and then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we will work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we will be online afterwards to respond, or we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenters will be answering questions at the end. And lastly, we have a number of webinars upcoming covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. In addition, we offer the mandatory Preventing Harassment training in English 3 times a year. With that, let's begin today's webinar. Guidelines for Conducting Effective Workplace Investigations. Today's interactive session will be facilitated by CJ Westrick. CJ Westrick has been in human resources management for over 20 years and has worked in companies with 25 to 1,750 employees nationwide. She obtained and continues to recertify her SPHR designation, which is Senior Professional in Human Resources, since 2002. CJ started HR Jungle, an HR consulting firm, in 2006, and now works with small to mid-sized companies, providing services ranging from situational assistance to full outsourcing of the company's human resources. While CJ started her HR career in the pharmaceutical and medical device industries, as a consultant, she has gained experience and expertise in numerous industries. CJ, I'll let you start today's presentation.
Thank you, Deb. Today we are talking about workplace investigations, so we're going to be covering what the benefits are of an effective investigation, the types of complaints, and we're going to go through 10 steps to conducting a successful investigation. There is a very short, I'll call it a quiz at the end, but it's only like 2 or 3 questions, but just to kind of see whether or not you can remember everything. Let's start with the first polling question, though.
Polling question, perfect. All right, so you should see a polling question on your screen, which will allow you to vote. And as we go through the presentation, please remember that if you'd like to ask any questions, to please use the questions box, and I will be monitoring that. All right, CJ, we've got about 75% of the people voting, and 20% say none, 38% say 1 to 5, and most everybody else says more than 5.
All right, and so we've got a little bit of everything out there, which is good. I know when I did my first one, I was very nervous, so for those of you that have not ever done one, this hopefully will be helpful to you. When we look at what the benefits are of an investigation, I mean, obviously primaries determine what happened, and to try and deal with the problems early, because depending on what you've got in your policies, it will make a difference on, how you have to do things and when you should do it. I also want to encourage your reporting
DJ, you have
protect
a
your company
lot
from
of
lawsuits, because this is particularly with this. A lot of what? Echo?
DJ, you have a lot of echo. Yeah, a lot of
Oops.
echo, and you're going in and out, mostly out.
Oh no. Okay, let me. I'm trying to hold still so my
Right,
microphone
you're
doesn't
good
do
now.
it.
If you want to try now, you're good now.
Okay. So I'll like try and keep stationary. But the protect the company from from lawsuits. Whoops, I'm going backwards. To avoid and counter bad publicity, just depending on how badly something happened, and to help build employee trust. So when we look at the types of complaints, there's a lot of different types. There's the formal ones where they've come to you and said, I want to make a complaint. It used to be we would always require the employee to put it in writing and we had a complaint form, but more recent laws have said we can't require it to be in writing from the employee. So they can just make a verbal complaint to you. Most of the time when that happens, you're going to be the one filling out the form instead and maybe having them sign off on it. But a lot of times, and it depends on what type of employees you have, they may feel intimidated to have to actually commit and put it to writing. And, and I think your job is to kind of help them get it on paper so that the company knows what they're dealing with. We've got the ever popular off the record. And this one is where I see this most often, to where you maybe have somebody at a supervisory level who's got a really strong relationship with someone at a lower level, and they say, okay, I want to tell you about this, but it's got to be off the record. And that's not legally possible. So keep in mind, you are still required to investigate when you get one of those. You have to just say, we'll try and keep it as private as possible or as confidential as possible, but we are still legally obligated to investigate. The anonymous. I personally have never had an anonymous one, but maybe, I suppose there are out there because people like to make calls, and who knows what it is. I figure if they make an anonymous one, you're still going to have to do something with it. So don't just ignore it when it comes in that way. Reports by managers and supervisors. These are really the critical ones, because managers and supervisors have to be trained that if they hear or see anything that they might be suspicious about, they have to report it, because now legally they can be individually sued as part of like a sexual harassment case. And so it's really important that if they hear a rumor, even if it's not within their own team, they need to let the company know what is going on. I actually am I've got a new client right now that is dealing with something like this, and it came more as a rumor. It was like an ex-employee called the company, and said that she was friends with one of their current employees who'd been out on leave. The current employee who's been on leave said, the only reason I'm coming back is so I can develop a harassment suit against the owner. So that's kind of this real third-party thing, but they're still having to investigate to find out what's going on with that. So it can come from very strange places, but be prepared for that kind of thing and have a plan in place of what's going to happen. The indirect complaints, maybe something comes up when you're doing a disciplinary meeting, something like that, or maybe even when you're doing a performance review. Departing employees seems to be a popular one. If they're not leaving under good terms, a lot of times they'll throw stuff out, either during an exit interview or just when they're leaving. This is part of the reason why. But again, even though that employee is leaving, that's making the complaint, does not negate the fact that you still need to investigate. Workplace observance. This is the one that's tricky, but you have to be very careful and observant with it, because people, sometimes you see something that just maybe doesn't feel quite right, or you're kind of like, what was that about? Don't let it go when you see stuff like that. Make sure your managers really know how to notice and to say something about it. Many times it'll feel like they're saying something about, it's like just, we'll call it the water cooler talk, and, it may be nothing, but unfortunately it's the company's responsibility to make sure it's nothing or to do something about it. Third-party reports are another possibility that somebody's going to say something that wasn't directly involved. And just like what my client heard about, from an ex-employee, that called and said something. So it can come in a lot of different ways. And mostly you just have to be aware that it can come in all different directions and to pay attention to it and deal with it. When you're doing an investigation, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that you're looking for the truth as much as you can find it. This is a sample of an investigation that happened back in 2014. Well, actually, the investigation was previous to that. It went to a jury and came out with a ruling in 2014. But a VP had said that he was wrongly terminated because of his age. He was 61. And where it came down hard on the company was that the whole investigation was one-sided. It looked like the HR people were just trying to save the company rather than find the truth and deal with it. If they had actually done it more fairly, they probably wouldn't have even ended up in court. They could have probably just dealt with it and said, yeah, it's not correct and we need to reinstate the person or do something. So there's a lot of things you can do to head it off, but mostly you want to keep in mind that every investigation has to be looked at with an open mind and to look at fairly, because in this one, the jury, the judge decided, it's like the jury said that it was a one-sided report. The judge actually wrote in his ruling that it was obvious it was trying to save IBM, the company, rather than determine if the employee had been treated fairly. So it really does make a difference on how these results come out and what you're looking at when you're doing this. So today we're going to be going through 10 steps. I'm not going to read all through them because we're just going to go right into them. But there are, have your plan of action. And even if it's the smallest thing, you can still rapidly go through these 10 steps to make sure you've done it correctly. So when we start off, we're going to determine the issues that would have to be investigated. And this goes back to what the complaint said. Did you get enough information to where you know what you're investigating? How serious is it? Is it illegal or in a potential lawsuit? Are we talking about whistleblower? Because an investigation is not just about sexual harassment. It's about any kind of discrimination or harassment that's going on or that's being reported. Is it a violation of the company policy? A lot of times you want to make sure your company policy is more in line with what you consider inappropriate than the next higher level, which might be illegal. If you wait until you are doing anything until it's actually illegal, you've blocked yourself from being able to take care of it before then. And that can be very important. And so look at that, and is there, a dispute over what happened? Have there been similar complaints? And if so, how were they handled? But you want to scale the investigation to the size of the problem. And I see this mostly when you get something like that little rumor, or somebody just thinks something might be going on. And it's like, well, it's not right now. I'll just wait and see what happens. Everybody knows that if you find somebody doing something extreme, then, definitely has to investigate. But the small ones that I think get put on the shelf and don't get looked at seriously, and then it develops a history for you. So if you ever have a bigger complaint and that history starts showing up that you ignored the little stuff, it's not going to go well for you because it looks like you're picking and choosing what you're going after. And you don't want to do that. There's different ways of doing it. You can still follow all 10 steps, but you can do it in a matter of, a couple of hours versus days. And so you always want to kind of size it and look at it based on what it is that the issue is. If it's a rumor, you're checking with your people, you're documenting it, making sure, what really happened and whether there's any truth behind it. But if it's a full-blown complaint that somebody just got mauled or somebody is being, picked on for, harassed in some way, then it takes more time because you're talking to more people. When you do find out what's going on, you want to be prepared to take immediate action. And you want to be able to protect what you're looking to do is to protect your employees. So what that looks like is going to be different every time. And you just want to make sure that you're doing something that makes the person who made the complaint feel better. So when I had, I think, my very first consulting a client, and this was back like almost 12 years ago, they had a company up in LA that had received a harassment complaint. And when I tried to talk with them, they said, oh, no, we talked to an attorney, we've handled it. 3 months later, I get another call back from them. Oh, it's back. And so it was like, oh, okay, let's back up. They listened to a business attorney, not an employment law attorney. And I will stress that in California, you really, really want to be talking to someone who specializes to know how to handle this stuff. The business attorney had said, break up the employees so that, there's not an issue there. And what they did was they took the complaining employee, basically gave her a promotion and moved her to a different office location. I mean, a whole different office in a different part of the city. And so in some ways that could have easily been perceived as retaliation to her against making the complaint. And what had happened that brought it back to life was that, because that was their solution, that's all they did. And they didn't actually investigate it. They told me that actually the CEO, and this is where you got to like take it with a grain of salt, the CEO said the boy didn't do it. And it's like, how do you know that? He told me. It's like, okay, that was the extent of their initial investigation. And so you want to make sure that you're looking at things a little bit bigger picture, but you're usually going to be told by an employment law attorney, don't do anything negative or that could be perceived as negative to the employee who made the complaint, because you're trying to protect that person. If you have to, if there's no way to break them apart other than having one not in the vicinity, consider a paid suspension to the person who was the subject of the complaint. So whoever was accused, maybe paid suspension simply while you're doing the investigation, or paid time off for the employee who complained. But, and you can do a transfer, but it's trickier, I think, because it can be persecution. So you want to be careful there. But you do want to be able to separate them so they're not having to stare at each other while this investigation is going on. And then you want to be able to appoint the right investigator. They should be perceived as experienced and impartial, or at least perceived as impartial. Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes HR is not going to be perceived as impartial. It depends on what the relationship has been within the company, the size of your company, stuff like that. So you really want to kind of look at that from the employee's eyes and whether or not that person looks like they're impartial. Subject matter expert is also sometimes useful, especially if you're looking at very specific things. And you want you want to be someone who is capable of taking action, or at least recommending some kind of action sometimes. Sometimes whatever the investigator finds goes directly to your employment law attorney, and then they're the ones that have the conversation with the company about what action should be taken. But keep in mind, you want people that know how to do some interviewing, and I know this is kind of where HR kind of comes up in a company most often, because they're supposed to be perceived as impartial, but I can guarantee you they are not always perceived as impartial. And interviewing skills, some people have better skills than others, so take a look at that. Gender really only comes into it if it's a very touchy issue, and it would be easier for someone of a certain gender to be asking the questions. You want someone who's going to be believable, capable of testifying, and to look at, be able to be perceived. So if this ever went to court and got serious on you, you want to make sure that whoever started this investigation could look good in court for you and look like they did an impartial, fair investigation. There are times when you could take a team approach where it's someone different for different segments of that, but often if you put two people in the room on the opposite side of a table from the one who's making the complaint or that you're asking the questions it can feel intimidating. If you ever use that just when you're interviewing new candidates for a job, you can tell, it does feel different, when you've got like a panel of people in front of you as opposed to a one-on-one kind of conversation. I actually know someone who, when she does investigations, she has a little laptop and she keeps it in her lap, so it's not even on the table as a blockade between her and the person she's talking with. So really give that some thought as to how you're going to do that. Once you found somebody, you want to kind of look at this and see. Now, when you're looking at investigator, there are rules. California has a law on this. And it's interesting the way the law read, and it comes down to who's got the better lobbyist, from what I'm told. So obviously, an employment law attorney is qualified. Sometimes they're not going to want to do it, or they're going to bring in an outside person to do it because they don't want to disqualify themselves from being able to litigate for you if it should go to court. So you're going to get mixed reviews on that. I actually know a couple of small labor attorneys who do employment law, but they're like a one-person office, and they don't have someone else they can refer it out to. And so kind of pay attention to that. HR professional is usually going to be an HR person within your company. I'm an HR consultant, and I can do it, but I can only do it under the umbrella of a law firm, because based on the law, it's got to be an attorney, a private investigator, and I guess it's because they're trained how to ask questions and how to actually investigate. Even though they don't know employment law particularly, they do know how to ask questions. And then, so trained management personnel is a possibility here. But technically, it has to be an employee, an attorney, or a private investigator. Those are the only three legally qualified to do an investigation for you. But if I've actually hired a private investigator to work with one of these attorneys I know in order to run that, because I know I had one attorney call me, and we found out that she did not have the proper liability insurance to cover me, and so I couldn't go in under her umbrella. So instead, I hooked her up with a private investigator to do the investigation, and then she worked with her client on what the action was going to be. So you really need to kind of make sure that you start off with the right people. While an employee can do it, again, make sure that they're going to look impartial and that they know how to do the investigation, how to ask the questions. So pick carefully, because this is the person who's going to carry a lot of the weight later on, depending on how serious this becomes. And at this point, I'll just see, Deb, are there any questions?
There's just one question, CJ. What if your supervisor is the person engaging in harassment or creating the hostile workplace environment?
It doesn't change the fact that you have to investigate. Normally, people say, take it, if you've got an issue, take it to your supervisor. But if they're the problem, you step over them and you go higher up. A lot of times in your handbook should actually specify, or in California now, every company is supposed to have a separate, even if you don't have a handbook, you're supposed to have a harassment prevention policy that is in writing, that everybody has signed, that has very specific instructions. That became a law a couple of years ago, that every company needed that, so even if you don't have a handbook. So take a look at your policy. See what it says as far as who is supposed to handle it. Most of the time, it's going to even say, my policies always say, you can report it to your supervisors, and supervisors are obligated to take it to these people. And usually that's going to be senior management or HR or an outside consultant, something like that, someone who can then knows what to do with the information. So if it is the supervisor, now if this is the owner of the company, it becomes so much trickier. And then it's having to talk with them to kind of figure out what's going on. Hopefully most people that own a company want to protect their company and will back down from what they've been doing and make this right. But you can't always be guaranteed of that. But if you get put between a rock and a hard place between the upper levels, you've got to at least know you can take it up to as far as the owner, and and say that it's complaint. The complaint is about a supervisor. It doesn't really change the method of the investigation, though.
Okay, and we have a couple of clarifications regarding the statement that you made about conducting an investigation through an attorney. If you are retained as an independent consultant to be like the HR manager for a company, would you not be able to conduct an investigation without an attorney?
Correct. I've actually had that question come up several times because I'm a consultant, and and I even asked there because there was one client that was like, well, what if we put you on as an employee for the length of that? And the attorney said, absolutely not. It's going to look very suspicious, and that's not legally, you're just not in the place to be able to do that. So if you're a consultant acting as the HR manager for a company, you still need that law firm to protect the company and you to do the investigation.
Mm-hmm. So even if you are an HR consultant, you should not give instructions to the employer on how to conduct the investigation unless there is an attorney involved.
You can actually, we'll call it, provide advice. You just can't conduct the investigation. So you could say, here's the steps, here's how you do it. I actually know a consultant who was always doing a lot. She loves doing investigations, and she was doing a lot of them under, in an association with law firms, and she actually went out and got her private investigator license so she could do them on her own. And it's not an easy thing. I mean, it's like one of those things that you need like 600 hours under an investigator. So it wasn't, an easy thing to do. And someone had suggested that for me, and it's like, I don't think so. I've got enough going on with HR. So yeah, keep in mind, consultants can't do it just on their own.
So that's all the questions for
and
now.
Okay, yeah. And when I've asked about that, the answer that's always come back to me is apparently private investigators have a better lobby than HR consultants because it's part of the law, and there's no particular reason why consultants, a lot of attorneys feel consultants should be able to do it, but we can't legally. So when you start planning your investigation, you've got to figure out what you're going to do. I've done so much as far as like even take a sheet of paper I use to start reading when I first meet with someone. But you want to look and see, okay, what is out there? What do you have? What, based on the complaint, do you need to find out? And who's got the information, and what best way is there to get it? So you want to have your list of like who you're going to talk with. What order makes sense to follow? What kind of questions do you want to ask? And and to make sure that you've informed the employee's manager that this is going on. And now, yeah, if the complaint is about that manager, it might get a little bit trickier. And but keep in mind that you need to, that they're going to notice people walking in and out of the little conference room. So you want to make sure, but you overall want to keep it fairly confidential, and only the people that need to be part of it are part of it. But you need to give some planning, ideas here as to where you're going to go with it all. Where you're going to do the interviews. There's so much open environment these days that you need to consider, where can you do it where it's not really obvious that you're doing this, but to set up the meeting, anticipate the worst case scenarios, don't make assurances that everything's going to be okay because you don't know that yet. And I always go in, it's like, as the investigator, you're going in looking for facts. That's what you're really doing. But, you be prepared for any kind of emotional responses. Be prepared for people to say, didn't happen. And, and when possible, get advice. You can get advice from the consultant, from your attorney. If it's a big deal that could end up like a public relations nightmare for the company, talk to the PR people. Let them know this is coming out, and and stuff like that. So it's not like it's going to be completely confidential, because there are people that need to be part of it to be able to make sure it's handled correctly. But you want to work on it as much as you can to go in with confidence, knowing exactly what your target is. When you're planning the investigation, you have to keep an open mind. Like that CEO who told me, boy didn't do it because the boy told him. Well, that's really not what you're looking for evidence. So avoid making assumptions. And you have to remain objective. And this is why you have to be really good at interviewing. Asking the questions, you don't get judgmental. You're just looking for what they have to tell you. And, so you don't do leading questions. Like you don't say, did Maria falsify her time card? Instead, it's like, did you and Maria discuss her time card last week? What did each of you say? So you're not putting words in their mouth. If you ever watch any of those court TV shows, you know what I'm talking about. It's like you can't feed, them information and hope they give you the right answer of that. That's not what your job is if you're investigating. And so conducting fair interviews. This is the big one. You've got different people you're looking at. You're looking at what we'll call the victim, the person who made the complaint. Although it won't necessarily be, I've actually had a complaint by a third party. And so I kind of had, in a way, two people accused. The accused is the person that's being complained about, and then you've got witnesses, if at all possible. Not every time will you have a witness, but you definitely want to ask for any witnesses that were around when that situation, the incident happened. So you want to be able to provide a brief explanation of the situation. This is where having it in writing really does help. So you just keep it very short and simple. You want to thank them for their time and explain why they are part of this interview. I mean, if they're the victim, then obviously they know why they're there. So because they've made the complaint. You want to really emphasize truthfulness. So it's always to the best of your knowledge. If because a lot of times they say, well, I don't really remember exactly what happened. It's like, well, then tell me what you do remember. Try and make sure that they're trying to at least stretch their brain a little bit. And that's another reason why doing this as soon as possible makes a difference, because time makes the memory fade and they won't be able to give you as accurate of a statement. And you explain that nothing, there are no conclusions until the investigation is complete. And then you can explain what the process is. And you know this because you already came through with your plan. Here's our plan of action. So you don't have to list all the names of people you're going to talk to, but you can say, I'm going to be, talking with any any witnesses, the person that was, accused, stuff like that. And to go through that. This is a sample of an opening statement. So I've been asked to investigate a complaint that involves you. The company is required by law to investigate all such complaints. These are simply allegations and no one has made any judgments about the allegation or conduct. You can read the rest. But you can see here the importance of making sure they understand this is not written in stone, whatever was the complaint. It's like, here's what we've heard and we're having to investigate. We're keeping an open mind, but we are required by law to do this. And so make sure they understand that part. Make sure everybody involved knows that there cannot be any retaliation. So, I mean, I've heard of situations where the witnesses were retaliated against. And so it ended up being a big court case. Usually if I've heard about it and I didn't experience it personally, it's because of a court case. So keep in mind, this is, I think, one of the harder things, and this is becoming one of the higher lawsuits these days, is the retaliation in a lot of areas, the harassment, this or that, but in, the retaliation, because when someone has made a claim of any type against someone in the company, it's very hard for the people that were around the people who was accused to not feel anger toward the accuser. And you really need to get those people to back down off that and not retaliate, because anything, it's against the law, it should be in a policy that says it's against the policy. And you want to keep repeating this to every single person you talk with, including upper management. There cannot be any retaliation. And and when you're talking to the people during the interview, you want to make sure that they report to you if there's any retaliation experienced, so that you can deal with that right off the bat. You do want to keep it as confidential as possible, and you only tell the witness the necessary facts in order to get their view of it. But keep in mind, it's open-ended questions again. It's like, this has been, that there was a situation or an incident between Sam and Mary. Did you witness something between those two people? You want to be careful not to give them information that they'll use and feed back to you. So, because you're looking for the truth. And have them, if most of the time you've got, well, not all companies have a non-disclosure agreement, but if you have one, then you want to make sure that you've got a signed copy of it in your files. And then maybe remind them that there is a confidentiality agreement, which means they can't talk about company stuff, and this is definitely company stuff. Even after they leave company, this is not open communication. And that if they start telling a lot of people about all the details of the investigation, they could be disciplined. Tell them who they are authorized to when you're doing an investigation. So you could let them know, okay, here's who I've talked with as far as getting advice and stuff. So if you want some advice, you could talk to our consultant or senior management, stuff like that. But you need to set a good example by not talking about it to everybody also. And again, you're looking for a private place for these interviews, because if they're looking at a window where everybody's standing outside there seeing them talk to somebody, they're going to ask that person what was going on. And then you're kind of testing their limits because they're really not wanting to explain it. And so make sure it is a private place, even if somebody has to give up their office so that it's an enclosed place that nobody's going to particularly notice. And the National Labor Relations Act does have some broad confidentiality requirements, or I'm going the opposite direction. There are confidentiality requirements that might be too broad that would violate a National Labor Relations Act ruling on there. So they're constantly making up rules as they go along a little bit. So we're kind of waiting to see, but that's why bringing an attorney into it, even if you don't need it for an umbrella. It's always good to talk to a lawyer and make sure that you have put your plan in place correctly. And, because in that way, at least you can move forward with a little confidence. And so look at that. When you're doing this, start with some of the easy questions to put people at ease and watch their body language. If you've ever done that, kind of watch and see. But you also, want to pay attention if their reaction seems a little odd, like they're really upset or aren't upset at all when you would expect them to be, ask more questions. Kind of figure out where this is going. Maybe they think they're either getting away with it, or maybe, they're trying to hide it. I mean, I've had investigations to where both parties seemed very truthful. You just couldn't pick up on anything from either of them, and they had completely conflicting statements. And so it's like, okay. And sometimes you have to make a gut reaction on this, on how believable it is, but get used to knowing how to ask those questions and, how to get them to where they are able to talk with you with some level of comfort, because you'll get a better level of information. Watch the tone of your voice, and keep your opinions to yourself. It really is. Can you confirm, Daryl hit Jeff on the loading dock yesterday? It's like, no, that's not an open-ended question. That's a yes-no question. What you're trying to do is to get this person to talk. Where did you work yesterday? Well, I was on the loading dock. Did you see anything unusual? Oh, maybe. Well, tell me what you think you saw, and if they said they didn't see anything, then you could pull it in a little bit tighter. Did you see an incident between Daryl and Jeff? So sometimes it might be that, okay, maybe they didn't get, maybe a swing didn't happen. Jeff didn't get hit, but maybe Daryl was yelling at him or in his face, like, 2 inches away from his face, yelling at him. Don't know, but that's what you're trying to find out. What exactly happened? And if you're just saying, did Daryl hit Jeff, you're going to get a yes or no, and you're not going to get your true question answered in there as to what happened. So look at that. When you're keeping an open mind, you're looking for any tangible corroborating evidence. So you're looking for a witness who actually saw something, or maybe there's emails or text messages that back up what this person's telling you. Look at the bigger picture. It's not just, witnesses aren't necessarily just a person. Nowadays, we've got all kinds of electronic witness available that, they chatted and you've got company records on the chat, you've got emails, you've got voicemails, things like that. It's sometimes surprising what people will be able to pull up as backup for what happened. And particularly if it's been going on a while. If it's a one-time off thing, they might not have a lot of backup. But if this is somebody who's been harassed over a long period of time, they've started collecting information, putting down times and dates. Ideally, if they can give you the exact date and time of day, that's beautiful because it gives you something to work with. But you want to kind of try and pull that together as tightly as you can. And you want to look and see about, are any of these witnesses, if they're people, do they have a bias that they're also pushing, their agenda on you? So you have to be, this is why it's so tough sometimes to do an investigation, because you've got to pull yourself out of it in the sense of, you become a little bit of a robot and, you're trying not to make judgments yourself. You're trying not to have your tone of your voice go, really? And stuff like that when they tell you what happened. And that you should always keep a very moderate level of speech when you're talking about this and move forward that way. And focus on facts. I often usually just tell people, you know what? I'm not necessarily going to be part of the decision-making team on what is going to be done here or what's going to be believed. I'm here to collect the facts. So think of like this is like the who, where, what, how type of thing that reporters look at. And, and so you're looking at that kind of thing. So what can you pull into this that gives you the best picture of what it is that the complaint was about? You want to find out other witnesses or evidence. Find out, it's like every person you interview, is there someone else I should talk to? Did you make a note of this? If you witnessed, there's a lot of times I'll get somebody who says, well, this happened, and sometimes they'll actually have people just volunteer. It's like, you know what, I wrote this up, that's something I witnessed. I don't know if you need it or not. That's great because it's backup for you. But you want to have, to kind of take get this in some ways as a temperature read too on whether or not they have concerns about continuing to work while you're investigating, particularly if they're the person who made the complaint or is the accused and they have to work together. So that's often when you're going to want to look and have management approve some paid time off in some way or another. And in order to give you time to investigate and not have them being punished because you don't know the way it's going to turn out. So you can't say, oh, you got to take unpaid time off while we investigate. It's like, no, you're not disciplining them because that's going to be seen as discipline. You're not in the mode of disciplining when you're investigating. You're investigating. And if you get somebody who makes a complaint, sometimes I've just had where something happened, the business owner will be worried about what it was. It seems like nothing came out of it, but he knows that people witnessed this. I said, well, you know what, stop and have each of the people that witnessed it write down what they saw or heard and keep those. So that if it ever turns out that this turns into a real complaint, we've at least done that much. And to take a look at it, because sometimes it's weird things that may not even qualify for, harassment or discrimination, but it was just strange enough, and maybe it's a one-off, but it was like, okay, and it hasn't happened again, but now you've got some backup to where if it happens again, you know how to deal, you can see a pattern. Look for contradictions, just like the one I told you where the accused and the accuser had very different things to say. Why? It's like on one of them, I know why. I did figure out why eventually, but you want to look at that and it's like, okay, so why do you think this person would say that if it wasn't true? Is there some piece of it that might be true or to you then that, you're going to agree with? And, I've just had some very unusual comments come back, but part of that is you've got to listen to it and ask questions about it, find out why it sounds different than, because ideally if somebody comes in and makes a complaint, oh, this person is discriminating against me because I'm 65 years old, and they keep talking about how I'm old all the time and blah, blah, blah. And then you get the other person, it's like, oh no, I never say anything like that. I wouldn't. They're a great employee. So it's like, why is that happening? Somewhere in there is the truth. But you've got to figure out where it is. Is one person being overly sensitive and they've taken what was said and blown it up into something bigger? But your questions are designed to find that out. You're not putting your own opinion on that. You're trying to figure out, is somewhere in there, can you get one of them to say something that makes it make sense? When you're at the close of an interview of each individual, ask, especially the complaining employee, what do you see? What would you like to see as an outcome to this? And sometimes, they're just, it's like, I don't like the phrase, I want closure, because that doesn't tell you anything. I actually had one woman who said, you know what, I'd like to have it branded on their forehead. And, that's not going to happen either. So you're looking at this, it's like, okay, it's like you're going to have something going on. I think you need to make sure, I think these days, particularly with so much going on with sexual harassment, particularly out there, people think that everybody's going to get fired that gets, has a claim against them for sexual harassment. That's not necessarily true. It usually has to be a pretty extensive thing. I think a lot of what you see in the news these days has been mostly because it's looking more at the PR side from the company standpoint, because these are known figures in their world. It's actors, it's owners of companies, but a big places where people see them. In your normal day-to-day company, you may not be able to fire that person. It may not have been serious enough for that. Maybe you send them out for harassment training. Maybe you do this or that, but sometimes it's not going to be that big. But you want to make sure that the person who makes the complaint has kind of like at least understand what they're looking for, and whether or not that's even going to be possible. Because you want to make sure they understand that the company will take what's considered legally appropriate action. It just may not be what you prefer, as the complainer, the accuser. And so keep that in mind, that they are walking away with something of a clear picture of what you're looking at. You want to ask the interviewees to contact you if they have new or additional information, if they start to feel retaliated against, and if they have questions about the investigation. It's best that they come to you, or if they hear someone talking about the investigation. You want to be able to hear about this stuff, and this is your investigation. You want to control it in whatever manner needs to be done, whether to talk to the people that are talking about the investigation, whether to talk to, the retaliation is a biggie, like I said, and or if they've just got questions, because I've seen a lot of times investigations are done, the company feels they handled it properly, but the person who made the complaint never really hears what happened. They kind of think, okay, this person got off because I haven't seen anything come out of it. And even the witnesses may feel that way. So if they come to you with questions, you're not going to want to say, okay, we wrote Sam up and we sent him out for this and this and that. You do want to just say, the company has taken appropriate action. If you see anything happen more about this that relates to this, please come talk to me. So you do want to be able to kind of close it down a little bit on that. Throughout this, you're gathering information, any documentation you've got. Keep in mind, there's been laws out now for a while about even emails. You'll find people that will go in and try and delete emails. It's like, I'm sorry, but unless you're really a super duper IT person, you can't completely delete something on your computer. There's software you can buy that will wipe your computer clean, but just going in and deleting an email does not make it go away forever. And so in some big cases, they're going in and doing deep searches into your computers, into your phone systems, into your emails, looking for any evidence. And legally, the digital evidence is just as protected and strong as verbal. And so keep that in mind. Don't try and cover it up. Look at what you've got and deal with it. And you want to evaluate, what do you have? So now, you've talked to everybody. You've looked at whatever evidence you've got. What is it you have? Do you have any kind of cooperation that it happened? Is there a consistency in this? Who's more plausible? Sometimes one person is going to be just more believable than another, whether it's because of what they say during the investigation or just because of what you know about the person. But you have to make sure that you're not just saying, oh, that person, it always makes everything into a big drama. You can't just brush it off like that. You still have to look and see, okay, but did what they say this time make sense? Just because they've maybe cried wolf before doesn't mean it didn't actually happen this time. So don't brush things off when you should be looking at them. You need to really pay attention to the credibility and see whether or not, you've got something there. Now it's time. Oh, and yes, don't forget, you can do follow-up interviews if needed. If you're really sitting there thinking, wow, this came up later on, but I didn't hear anybody mention it before, you might want to go back and talk to a couple people and say, this showed up here and I want to ask more questions. And look at that. And then you have to take action. You want to end the problematic behavior. You want to figure out what the appropriate discipline is. And, whether or not that might be termination, criminal prosecution, counseling, you want to right the wrong in the sense of you want to make things right for the person who made the complaint. You want to protect the employees. That's one of your number one things is your job in the company. Well, the company's job is to protect your employees from further harassment, from uncomfortable situations. This is what all the harassment and laws are about, is protecting those employees. So make sure that, they've got something. And then you want to communicate. As I said, make sure that everybody knows it's now been closed. And, I would just end for the victim, you might want to say just slightly more than you do to anyone else. But, so the accused, maybe you've decided to send him off for counseling, or you put them, her out into training to understand the difference of, being, a stalker versus not. But you want to make sure everybody understands it's a closed issue, that you've done something. And you need to write up a report. Now, with this, you want to be objective, specific. You describe your reactions. It was funny because who knew it would come in handy? When I was getting my degree, I had some electives and nothing was of interest except criminal justice classes. And I ended up taking like 4 of them. A lot of fun, actually, particularly if you're in HR. And, to kind of see. And I ended up writing my investigative reports that look very much like a police investigative report. It's like, that, that Sam stated, blah, blah, blah. So I'm either doing direct quotes or I, allege that this happened, something like that. But you want to make sure that how you're writing the report, because this thing will live on forever, that it is very clear that it's not showing a bias in how you're doing it, that you've written it as objectively, and if you could, verbatim. I mean, I will usually have a little laptop that I'll be kind of typing away as the person I'm interviewing is talking. I usually have to go back and clean up all my typos, but at least it gives me the basic concept of what was just said. And and there's times when if it's important enough, I will type it up, I'll go back and clean it, and I'll say, okay, now this is what I heard. Is this correct? And, because I want to make sure that what I am reporting is correct and truthful. So keep that in mind, that you're looking at something like that. And because, it's funny because I looked online before I did my first one trying to figure out, is there like some special report? And there really isn't out there. There's things you can buy, but it's basically the same thing. It's just saying, write it, when you always put on there the time and date that you were interviewing this particular person. And then you write down, here's what they said happened, and then you go to the next one, and so kind of you can have a formula template or a template set up that says, okay, here's the sections of each, the report for each witness, and then you collate it together, or you just keep them as, for each witness, here's my report when you're turning it in. Keep in mind that the investigative report, when you're done, you've turned it into management, they probably shared it with the attorney. Keep it in a sealed envelope when it's all done, to put in the employee's file, because it shouldn't be there to be freely looked at by anybody else, not their supervisor, not them, It's there in case you have a problem in the future. But it's not open. It is private. Most of the time you have employee files where maybe you have a separate employee file for legal issues. You stick it in there if you've got that. Otherwise, you put it in a sealed envelope in their file so that it never gets looked at by anybody else. And then you want to do your little follow-up. Like I said, follow up with the people, especially the person who complained and the accused. You want to monitor the workplace. You're looking for retaliation. You really are, because this is where it becomes most dangerous. And then you kind of look at what caused this. Do we need to do new training? Do we not have the policies in place that should be there to help prevent this kind of thing? Take a look at that kind of thing and figure out what we could have done to prevent this from happening. Was it more training? And often it's training. A lot of times harassment complaints are because people don't know what qualifies as a true, especially sexual harassment. They think, during this whole Me Too thing, I think the one that sticks in my brain so much is wow, is someone made an accusation that someone tried to kiss them in the elevator. That one is just stuck in my mind, and it was 40 years ago, but it's stuck in my mind that, that's sexual harassment in their mind. So people have a lot of different levels of understanding of what qualifies legally as sexual harassment. It's not nearly as easy to do, but to actually hit the legal side of it, but there's a lot of stuff goes on that is considered inappropriate. And that's really where you want people to understand. That's what you want your employees to be trained on. What qualifies in your world as inappropriate? And does your policy really state that? Because a lot of times the policies are written to be based on what the legal stuff says, but you want to make sure you bring it down to a day-to-day use of that. Provide examples of, not necessarily in your handbook or your policy, but, if you're doing some training, talk to them about, what an example of inappropriate is, or to, have them go through, because a lot of times harassment training does talk about some of that. Some of those will try to say, here's what and here's whether or not it would be harassment or just inappropriate. And even inappropriate you need to deal with. And it doesn't require necessarily a full-fledged investigation because it's only inappropriate, but you still want to deal with it and look at it and make sure that it's only inappropriate and that it gets stopped. So we have our Deb's final questions here. There's only a couple, but I'll let her take that.
Great. We have some polling questions, and then CJ, we have quite a few follow-up questions. So I'll do the polling questions first, and then we'll do the follow-up questions later. So types of complaints you should investigate include off the record, anonymous, reports by managers, or all of the above. So this is just a short quiz from the materials that we heard CJ present today. So if you can take some time to vote here. We're getting quite a few votes in, and CJ, 100% of the people say all of the above.
All right, we're listening. That's correct.
Listening. All right. The next polling question. Some things to consider when choosing an investigator include gender, impartial, capable of testifying, or all of the above. And we've got about 40% of the people voting. I'll wait till there's a few more votes in. And we've got 11% say impartial, 6% say capable of testifying, and everybody else says all of the above, with 0% saying gender.
Well, gender is one of the things. So it is all of the above, because the gender was specific only to the type of complaint it was, to where you're trying to make the people more comfortable. So if it's something, where it really would make a difference on them having to talk, that their interviewer is a male or female, then the gender would play a role. Otherwise it wouldn't, but it is all of the above.
Excellent. And our final polling question. When conducting an interview, please select one of these answers. Either make a quick judgment call, or start the interview with difficult questions, or keep your opinions to yourself, or all of the above. And we've got a good number of people voting already. So 100% say keep your opinions to yourself.
Oops, I'm putting myself on mute. All right, great. You guys did great with that. So what kind of questions do we have?
All right, so let's go back to the questions here. Let's see. So a lot of the questions still go back to that fact that you need an attorney involved, and I'll just go through them. What are HR consultants to do if a client requires an investigation? Just tell them they cannot do it, or get approval from a hired attorney, or how do you go about that as a paid consultant?
Okay, I explained the law to him. I said, it's like, I can help with this, but I can't do it myself without bringing in a law firm. So is it okay? It's like, do you have a law firm that we can talk with, or do you want me to recommend one? And I'll just take it like that. I'll take it as if they want me to do it, but then when you look at all the options, they may choose a different option than you doing it.
Okay. And I think that's the last question on that subject. We've got some other subjects. I'm just going to read this one verbatim. What if other employees are accusing an HR employee of harassing them, but there are no actual proof? How do you handle investigating an HR employee when you're the HR manager?
Like you do anyone else. You have to kind of sit there and look. I mean, if it's an if you're the HR manager and you've got someone under you who's being accused, you're going to, the personality of the person a little bit more. So in some ways you'll be able to tell whether or not it sounds like it might be true. But I think you still have to conduct it the same. Or if you really want to look like you're impartial, you might want to bring in somebody from outside to do it for you. Do the investigation for you, because it's within your department. I think it would be very hard for you, even if you were impartial, to appear impartial.
Got it.
And I'd probably suggest bringing in someone else. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you record investigation interviews? What are the legal requirements around that?
I don't know that you can't. But I think I'd be careful, because it would be, I think overall, the general sense is that it feels more intimidating to have the recorder going. But, I also understand from my side, because it's like, wow, I wish I could have recorded it to make sure that I wrote everything down correctly in my report. But I think if you're going to do that, it's more, in California, there's a lot of privacy laws, and I think that's where you're probably more likely to butt up against something. So if you're really planning to record it, I think you're going to have to be prepared to also not have it recorded, because you have to get the person's permission. And some people might say, I wouldn't be comfortable with that. And so you have to have your backup plan. You might be, some people say, yeah, that's okay, turn it on. Others will say no, and you still have to be able to type it out or write it out, whatever. So just kind of have a plan in place. I don't think you can do it without their permission.
Okay. I would like to acknowledge that it is just after 11 o'clock. We'll be answering just a couple of more questions online here. And it looks like we are going to be able to get to everyone's questions. So if you're able to hang on just a few more minutes, we'll get to these questions. If you're not able to hang on, we totally understand. And this session is being recorded, and the recording will be available. And we will send out a link later on today. So just a couple of more questions. Do you recommend having both internal HR and in-house counsel conducting the interview together, or is that potentially too intimidating to the interviewee? When should or shouldn't the in-house counsel participate in the interview?
Okay, so if you're big enough that you've got in-house counsel, this might be one of those situations where you break up the interviews. I think it would be too intimidating to have both the HR and the attorney in-house counsel doing the interviews together, because that's just going to make somebody nervous and they won't be remembering as well. But you might separate out the interviews and try and figure out, it's like, okay, does it make more sense to have in-house counsel do this group of people and I'll go do this group of people, something like that. But I'd either stick it with one person or to break them up, but I don't think I would recommend doing them with both the HR and attorney without making people more nervous than you want them to be.
Okay. And what advice do you have for HR managers who are not comfortable with conducting interviews and writing the final report, and they want to improve on those skill sets?
Ugh. Okay. I think the best thing you could do would be to, find some friends or, it's like, and sit down and come up with a topic. It's like something you know about them and just say, okay, and conduct an interview. Pretend you're writing a paper on, it's like, okay, one of my hobbies is watercolor painting. And so, all right, you come to interview me. Okay, so tell me, how did you get interested in this? Ask your questions like you would, it's like, how would you find out everything that they know, or at least one, and then practice writing it up. And, because some of it's just experience. I mean, the upside of doing an interview and writing it up is the fact that you're really writing what they've said. I mean, literally, it's like I write down when I'm doing it, it's like, okay, here's the question I asked. Here's what they responded. Here's the question I asked. Here's what they responded. Blah, blah, blah. Just keep going like that. So don't make the report more complicated than it needs to be. You're just looking to get down on paper what was said during that interview, both by you and the person you were interviewing. But if you just want practice with interviewing, kind of look at your friends and just say, would you, let me spend 15 minutes asking you questions and see whether or not you're able, and it's just practice like that.
That might be a great topic for a future webinar too, especially on how to write the investigation reports.
Yes.
And CJ, just real quick before we leave, do you know anything about Texas and whether using a recording in Texas is allowed?
Well, Texas doesn't have nearly as many employment laws as we do here in California. And I would say, because it's usually the California privacy laws that would, I'd still probably go with the fact that, you want to ask the person, because in the end, if they haven't given you permission, you're made more nervous by recording it. And so even if they're not legally, if legally you can do it, I think you might want to kind of think about what it is you're trying to achieve there. And if it's just accuracy, but biggest thing in doing these interviews is to make sure the person is comfortable enough with you to give you the truth. And so if they're not comfortable with recording, even if it's legally allowed, then you're having to struggle to get the whole truth out of them. So I think you but excellent. Was that it?
That's it. So thank you for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We will send information by email with instructions on how to access a copy of the presentation on our website. Thank you, CJ, for your time and expertise today. We hope all of the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of your time. Be sure to join us on May 15th for a webinar titled Active Shooter Armed Assailant Response. It's training for the DHS Run, Hide, Fight protocol. Thank you very much and have a safe day.